Pursuant to Standing Order 1.
Conformément à l'article 108.2 du règlement et conformément à l'ordre de renvoi, le comité va continuer son étude sur les mesures d'immigration pour la protection des groupes vulnérables. Veuillez noter qu'en raison de la nature délicate de l'étude du comité, les témoignages des témoins pourraient être choquants pour les participants, de même que pour le public. Aujourd'hui,
Mr. Michael Butsurkiw, here in Ottawa, former spokesperson, Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Welcome. Mr. Alexander Galkin, Director for the Right to Protection, R2P, who's appearing by video conference from Mariupol, Ukraine. Also joining us by video conference from Kiev, Ukraine, Ms. Irina Dovhan, Mr. Gennady Afanasyev, and Mr. Alexander Urishchenko. We will be providing 7 minutes for testimony from each of the witnesses, and we'll begin with Mr. Butsurkiw here in Ottawa. Mr. Butsurkiw, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear committee members, Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to speak before you today. It is indeed a great pleasure and an honor to be back here in Ottawa. I've been specifically tasked to address the situation of internally displaced people in Ukraine and to propose recommendations on what Canada can do to assist those affected. Ladies and gentlemen, a little over 2 years ago, Ukraine had no displaced population. Today, it is in the top 10 list of countries around the world with the largest number of internally displaced peoples, or IDPs. Now, there are essentially two contributing streams to this phenomenon. One, of course, is the illegal occupation of Crimea in March 2014, which sent a stream of men and women out of the peninsula and into areas controlled by the Ukrainian government. Second, of course, is the occupation of Luhansk and Donetsk by heavily armed individuals, which prompted upwards of 2 million Ukrainians to abandon their homes and communities for safer ground. And you should know that many of those who fled are women and children. Now, it's the situation of the Donbas IDPs which I wish to address today, and in front of you is a map of Ukraine with the heavily colored areas where most of the IDPs have fled to. In my 2 years with the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, I made several trips to Donetsk and Luhansk where we met with displaced families. We met them in processing facilities, in temporary homes, in collective centers, and some families near Slovyansk were even sheltered in abandoned train cars. Most were forced out of their homes and villages, not voluntarily, but by intense shelling, while others feared legitimate persecution by rebel groups. At first, most IDPs expected to be gone just a few weeks or months, and hence they didn't take many of their belongings with them or much documentation with them. But as the situation in Ukraine devolved into a frozen conflict, the Minsk Accords notwithstanding, many are now resolved to the fact that they may never go home. The extent of the damage after months of intense, indiscriminate shelling is absolutely mind-boggling. Roads, bridges, factories, airports, railway tracks, and essential infrastructure have been severely damaged. Even if peace were suddenly to take hold, as the OSCE has documented, there is still a large amount of unexploded ordnance and landmines, which makes it very difficult for civilians to travel back. Among the more than 9,000 killed so far are hundreds who have been struck by landmines. And we now know that cluster munitions have been used, including by the Ukrainian side, and this poses a particular threat to children. And just a quick footnote, among the some 9,000 killed are 298 individuals from several countries who perished in the downing of MH17. And I urge you, when you have time, to take a moment to remember them, because on Sunday, July 17th, it was 2 years ago since that plane was shot down. Now, as I said, there are many who have legitimate fears about returning to areas under rebel control. Any IDP who has expressed critical opinions about the rebels are at risk. There are well-documented examples of writers and others appearing on so-called blacklists at rebel-run checkpoints. Similarly, there are well-documented cases of journalists and others being detained, tortured, or they have disappeared completely. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recently said it has investigated the deaths of at least 47 people in rebel-controlled areas. And in one particularly troublesome case, it obtained forensic evidence showing that a 6-year-old girl, her mother, and her grandmother were killed by gunshot wounds to the head in the rebel-held area of Luhansk. It's believed they were abducted by Cossack members of the so-called LPR. Many of the people who have fled their homes, communities, and jobs were professionals, engineers, journalists, business owners. While many have found employment in areas controlled by the Ukrainian government, many are still unemployed, working well under their previous pay grade, or have been forced to switch to less desirable professions, for example, taxi drivers. While the integration of Donetsk IDPs has been mostly smooth, this in itself is extraordinary given how woefully unprepared the Ukrainian government was to process them. There are reports of discrimination against Donetsk residents in their host communities and regions. For example, they experience problems seeking employment, trying to get apartments, seeking spots for their kids in schools, and opening bank accounts. A lack of civil documentation creates additional problems for the IDPs. And we are seeing a growing number of undocumented children potentially leading to a risk of statelessness. I should also add at this point that although their numbers are not huge, there are some minority groups, such as the Meskhetian Turks, who are living in very dire temporary shelters in Donetsk. By some reports, there are 2,000 Meskhetian Turks who have been forced to flee their homes in Ukraine since the fighting started. So what can Canada do, ladies and gentlemen? Well, for one thing, we should be encouraging the public and private sectors to create more internship opportunities for displaced Ukrainians. Also very important and connected of this, of course, is liberalizing procedures for young Ukrainians to be able to travel to Canada to take up scholarships and internships. And of course, at the same time, encouraging Canadian academic institutions to open more spaces for this category of Ukrainians. Now, I don't think anyone here can dispute the value of face-to-face contacts of young Ukrainians with Canadian values, with Canadian people, communities, and institutions. Yet, there are many young Ukrainians who have been denied visitor visas to Canada for unexplained reasons. I know, for example, of one particular case where a young Ukrainian woman who had worked for at least one Canadian election observation mission in Ukraine and now works for the government of Ukraine was denied a visitor visa. So I ask you, what kind of example are we showing when Ukrainians who have worked for our country and upheld our values are rewarded with a no entry stamp in their passport? Ladies and gentlemen, while it's very easy to paint the picture of the plight of IDPs in terms of numbers and trends, there is a human face, and much of it, as I've seen for myself, very sad indeed. Along with colleagues from the OSCE, I have followed IDPs along the contact line who were so desperate to check on their properties and belongings that they risked their lives to cross the contact line, to see what remained of their bombed-out apartments, to collect precious belongings from piles of rubble, and to take a private moment to trace the faces of long-lost relatives in photos that have been almost completely obliterated by soot and damage. To close, I want to tell you that when I first came to work for the OSCE as a seconded Canadian spokesperson, our OSCE ambassador to the OSCE in Vienna explained to me how, in many multilateral institutions like the OSCE, Canada punches well above its weight, for example, contributing a high number of Canadian monitors to the Special Monitoring Mission. So when it comes to assisting Ukraine and its enormous numbers of displaced peoples, let's too punch above our weight. Let's think outside the box, be innovative, and clearly demonstrate that we are people whose rhetoric is matched by action. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Buturkiu. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Alexander Galkin on video from Mariupol for a 7-minute statement.
Dear the Chair and the members of the committee, I am delighted to have such a great opportunity to share with you our vision of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Right to Protection R2P is a Ukrainian not-for-profit organization operating in close partnership with the global NGO HIAS. R2P protects human rights of vulnerable populations, the internally displaced, the refugees, the stateless, and those at risk of statelessness. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Social Policy, at the end of June 2016, there were almost 1.8 million internally displaced from Donbass and Crimea registered. The most pressing problem facing the internally displaced is housing. Although the state is legally obliged to provide accommodation to people for the first 6 months of displacement, the available social housing and collective reception centers have been limited. The latter has only managed to accommodate between 30 and 40,000 of the most vulnerable people. Another acute issue facing IDPs is employment. In regions with high concentrations of IDPs, for instance, government-controlled Donetsk and Lugansk regions, the labor market was tight even before the conflict. With increased economic pressure resulting from the crisis, the employment situation is deteriorating further. Discrimination is also common in the workplace, with many job postings openly stating that people from Donbass will not be considered. From February through June 2016, the government suspended pensions and social benefit payments to about 600,000 internally displaced and those living in non-government controlled areas without prior notification. The prolonged suspension of payments has had direct effects on those individuals for whom these payments were the sole source of income. According to R2P monitoring, 85% of IDPs interviewed were significantly impacted by the suspension of their social benefits and or pensions. This situation has had a particularly detrimental effect on persons with disabilities, reduced mobility, and or poor health. According to the government, it has recently resumed pension payments to 80,000. However, this means that around 500,000 Ukrainian citizens previously receiving a pension no longer do so and are presumably living in poverty. The government of Ukraine has linked the payment of pensions, which is a constitutional right, with the payment of IDP social benefits. The social benefits to IDPs, it's about 46 Canadian dollars per month, are generally inadequate to meet housing costs or other expenses, such as the transportation of children to school. The guiding principles on internal displacement are meant to ensure that displaced persons are able to move freely during displacement. However, restrictions on the right to liberty of movement continue in Ukraine. At the end of June, crossing the contact line turned dangerous because of the hot weather. Many people spend hours in lines under the burning sun without access to shade or water. Journalists reported on death of elderly persons waiting in line near the checkpoints Zaitsev and Stanitsa Lugansk. Electronic permits for crossing checkpoints between government control areas and non-government control areas are required, but there are many people unable to complete an internet application because of the lack of skill or unavailability of computers. Overall, people living in the non-government control areas continue to experience problems accessing essential services and adequate social assistance. In order to receive social benefits, people must either relocate to the government control areas or regularly travel across the contact line. Some people, for example, unemployed adults or working age families with 1 to 2 children, have become increasingly vulnerable due to lack of social benefits and exclusion from humanitarian assistance schemes. According to our monitoring, 93% of IDPs interviewed who reported residing in the non-government controlled area were significantly impacted by the suspension of their social benefits payments or pensions. The majority, 79% of them, reported that they received pensions from Ukrainian government, and the pension is either their main or only source of income. The situation of people residing on both sides of the contact line remains especially dire, and their access to humanitarian and medical aid is impeded due to security reasons and the ban on cargo deliveries. R2P monitors report that the situation is critical regarding access to health services in the buffer zones or small towns and villages located close to the contact line. IDPs in rural areas in the south part of Donetsk Oblast region, as well as inhabitants of buffer zones, complain about the absence and availability of medical services. No medical facilities or physicians can be found in most villages in the south part of Donetsk region along the contact line. In December 2015, the Ukrainian Cabinet of Ministries adopted a 2-year comprehensive state program for support, social adaptation, and reintegration of displaced until 2017, along with an unaccompanied action plan. The program and the action plan provide a framework for addressing various issues related to internal displacement, including durable solutions. However, in view of economic and financial constraints, no budgetary allocations have yet been made available for the program's implementation. Initially, the institutional framework which the government has been operating was complicated by many ministries tasked with supporting IDPs, but without any real coordination among them. The government of Ukraine has recently created the Ministry for Temporarily Occupied Territories and Internally Displaced Persons. However, it's too premature to assess the ministry's performance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Galkin. We now move to Kyiv to our 3 witnesses who have spent time in incarceration in the occupied territories, and we will begin with the testimony of Ms. Irina Dovhan. Ms. Dovhan.
Hello. Hello. My name is Irina Dovhan. I live in a small town close to Donetsk. Prior to those events in my region, I used to own a private beauty parlor where I used to work as well as a beautician. When in the summer and spring in 2014, a relentless propaganda campaign was launched in my town. I was proactive, and I talked to people around me. I wanted our country to stay united, and I spoke about the possible risks if a neighboring state interferes. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated. It was very fast. And it became more and more dangerous to express your own opinion. In my own town, I could see people wearing combat fatigues, and they were armed, and they spoke with a distinct Russian accent. Donetsk was full of armed people. Artillery positions were set up. There were more and more arms. I drove to the unoccupied areas, and when I saw the first checkpoint of the Ukrainian army and I met the Ukrainian military, I talked to them. They were dressed, their clothes were worn out, they were torn. They were underfed, they had no personal care items. It was a horrible situation, and this was my army, the army of my country, Ukraine. On my return home, I spared no effort in collecting items needed by the Ukrainian army. Soon, other women that I knew joined my efforts. I met them through my work. We started collecting blankets, bed sheets, T-shirts. We cooked soup and made pancakes, and almost every day we took risks to take it to the Ukrainian army. Every day it was becoming more and more difficult. During my last trip, we managed to receive through some volunteers in Kyiv, combat fatigues. We took them to the new position of the Ukrainian army. It was a brigade there. And on my return from the last trip, I was caught in the crossfire, and my house was shelled. It was damaged. It took me several days. I was hiding in the cellar of my house, and my neighbors joined me there as well. To avoid those risks, I decided to send to the free areas all the notes that I had taken. When people would give me a monetary donation to assist with the Ukrainian army, and the person who was supposed to take those notes, he was stopped by the terrorists. He was beaten badly, and to save his own life, he said that he had items given to him by a Ukrainian patriot. He gave my address, and he said that I had always actively promoted Ukraine and that I was carrying a Ukrainian flag on my car. Then, armed men in 2 trucks came to my place to arrest me. They were local people and people who, military people, I think, who spoke with a Russian accent. They broke into my house, beat me up. I told them right away the PIN number of my safety deposit box. They searched through the entire house. They collected and seized all valuables, computers, TVs, and they found 2 pairs of binoculars that belonged to my husband. And that was the basis why they said that I was an artillery spotter guiding artillery strikes. So they handcuffed me. I was blindfolded, and they took me to Donetsk, to the Vostok battalion. I was subjected to cruel interrogations. They wanted me to give them addresses and names of those people who helped me in assisting the Ukrainian armed forces. I resisted, and I understood what I meant to those people. That is why they sent me for another interrogation. It was Ossetians. There was a part of this Vostok battalion. These were very cruel people. They were implacable. They beat me. They stripped me. They used to fire guns and shot close to my ear. They threatened me with rape. I said many things that I didn't want to say. I gave the last names of people, but I knew that those people had already left town. After that, after I told them everything, they took me and they placed me in the central square of Donetsk, put me next to a post, and they put a sign around my neck saying, "Accomplice of punitive forces, assassin of children." And I was beaten by people who were passing by. There were people who passed, they had a Russian accent, they drove by in jeeps with the words Allahu Akbar. They beat me, they tried to shoot my kneecap. It lasted for about 5 hours. In between, I could see that someone took a photo of me. It was a man wearing a white shirt. It was a foreign journalist. And that photo that was used by the New York Times saved my life. There, in the square, in the central square, I stood next to that post for about 5 hours. Then another armed force group tried to seize me. But those who brought me there fought them off and got me back to the Vostok battalion. And again, I was subjected to cruel torture. They hit me in the chest. They sprayed me with pepper spray in the face. I was in a very narrow cell. The cell was inside the room. There were about 10 military people in that room, and I saw other detainees who were brought to that room, how they were beaten, and then they were placed in other cells for further interrogation. I cannot tell everything, this horror that I went through during those 5 days. I had no food. I barely had any water, almost nothing. And even now, I just don't have enough strength to tell some details of what happened to me there. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask Mr. Gennady Afanasyev for his statement. Mr. Afanasyev.
Я Афанасьєв Геннадій Сергійович, звільнений політв'язень. Я народився 1990 року напередодні здобуття Україною незалежності у Сімферополі. Закінчив університет за спеціальністю права. Професійно займався фотографією. У момент захоплення Криму Росією допомагав українським військовим, які перебували в Криму.
Also worked as a photographer. At first, I was against Maidan because of the Russian propaganda, but eventually I came to realization that it was propaganda. On the 9th of May 2014, I took part in the Victory Day parade in Simferopol. And I had a picture with me of my great-grandfather. He is the pride of the family. He participated in World War II. Suddenly, some men in civilian clothes detained me and took me into a car. In the car, they threw me on the ground, on the floor, and put a bag over my head. They were driving me. They took me to my apartment. They took my keys. They brought me into my apartment. I had a bag over my head. They were looking for some compromising pro-Ukrainian materials. Then they detained me. These were FSB personnel. They kept hitting me, beating me. They were beating me with boxing gloves, so not to leave any on my head, not to leave any tracks. I was detained for many days. I was surrounded all time by interrogators, FSB officers, and they were requested. They wanted from me into incriminating information on myself and other people. They were trying to accuse me that I wanted to explode Eternal Light Memorial. I have to tell you some very unpleasant details about my detention, because I think that you all should be aware of all horrible things that are going on. It's been 2 years since annexation of Crimea, and there are many people who've gone through similar experiences that I experienced. I was subject of tortures. They put on my head a gas mask with the hose, unscrew a lower valve, and sprayed the gas inside. I was throwing up. I was choking on my own vomit. They asked me to give evidence against Alexander Kolchenko and Oleg Sentsov. I refused to incriminate them. In response, they continued with torturing me. They demanded from me also to sign a plea agreement. Because of all the torture and pressure, I had to sign it. Also, they were threatening to hurt my mother, and that gave an effect. During the trial of Alexander Kolchenko and Oleg Sentsov, I rescinded my testimony in front of witnesses and told in the court about the torture and the ways they made me to give evidence against innocent people. Then I was transferred to prison again, but fortunately, because of the independent lawyers and human rights defenders, I managed to record these incidents. But no one was actually punished for the torture that I suffered. I was transferred to nowadays Gulag, which is the colony in the Komi Republic. The transfer was really hard. Air temperature reached 40-45 degrees. Railroad cars were so hot that they should have been cooled down. They had to be cooled down by firefighting vehicle. There was no water, no toilets inside those cars. For 2 months and 15 days, I have no communication with no one. I didn't see anyone and didn't talk to anyone except prison administration and security officials. the story is a very short version of an event that happened to me over a period of 2 years. Every day, for a person who stays in solitary cell, it's it lasts like an eternity. It's a horror movie that is shown every day. So I appeal to the international community to fight for those prisoners who are still captured, to support their family, and to maintain sanctions regime against Russia until the Kremlin meets its commitments. Thank you very much. Дякую, пане Афанасьєв. Тепер надаю слово пану Олександру Грищенку. Також хочу відмітити, що ви бачили там скетчі на екрані. Це
who was incarcerated in Donetsk, and his testimony, his preferred method of bearing witness was through sketches of what he lived through. Thank you. So, Mr. Grishchenko, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alexander Grishchenko. Before July 2014, I lived and worked in the city of Lugansk, in east of Ukraine, which is occupied by the illegal military groups now. I worked as a deputy director of Lugansk Regional Veterinary Medicine Hospital. On 15th of July 2014, Lugansk separatist militants captured me when I was entering our hospital office. I was unreasonably accused of attempt to install technical devices for artillery spotting for the armed forces of Ukraine. They caught and searched me. I had photo camera with me, and on its memory card, separatists found some photos of pro-Ukrainian protests in Luhansk, in which I had taken part, and also some photos from Kiev Maidan barricades. As soon as they see those pictures, they told me that they must shoot me on sight, or at least shoot my legs. But they told me that they won't be doing themselves, that they will have to call special so-called counterterrorism unit. They took me to the Volodymyr Dal East Ukrainian National University, which had been occupied by the troops of separatist militias, called Rapid Response Team Batman. Batman is a nickname of its leader, Alexander Alexandrovich Bednov. In a basement of dormitory, which was turned into a prison, they tortured me, demanding from me to accuse myself of working for the Ukrainian army. They were beating me with their arms and legs, using electric stunning device, suffocating with a back, beating with a piece of plastic pipe, twisting my fingers, using a surgical saw, making cuts between the fingers of my left hand. They put me under enormous psychological pressure. They poured me over with unknown chemical solutions. They also poured it inside my mouth. During next several days, they were often coming to my cell, humiliating me, unreasonably beating me with arms, legs, and sticks. They also used a hammer and other tools. There was a person whose nickname was Maniac, and he especially was brutal in his torture of me. I also witnessed when this person named Maniac, he was a sadist, and he abused a young girl aged approximately to 15 years old. Also, there were a number of tortures and incidents that I witnessed. another example that I can provide, that when a young girl, she was given as a gift to other militants in front, and there was a sexual assault in front of all people around. Before my eyes, they tortured to death a man who was drunk and not understanding where he was, said that he was from United Ukraine. Just for saying these words, he was tortured to death. Besides of these examples, I saw several corpses of the captured, which they were taking out of the basement. There was an episode when, after beating and tortures, a spleen of the detainee happened to be ruptured, and it caused an internal bleeding. His life was saved only after an urgent ectomy of the injured organ in a city hospital. There was a lot of Russian military men among the militants of the rapid response team Batman. And they didn't hide at all that they were from Russia. Some of them were also put for a short time to cells for different transgressions, in most cases for alcohol abuse. Sometimes they were nearly unconscious because of the enormous amount of the alcohol that they drank. The conditions of detention didn't meet any sanitary standards. More than a month, they kept us in almost absolute darkness. People were captured and detained for ridiculous accusations to have enough unpaid labor power and to force these people to give to the militants their money, houses, cars, and other property. Sometimes they involved in a compulsory labor even seriously injured people and people with broken limbs. They repeatedly used prisoners for looting, plunders of trading companies' warehouses, and accomplishment of the houses and robbery of the houses occupied by militants. As the information of these crimes began to spread, to hide these crimes, Batman ordered to physically destroy the prisoners who had stayed in the basement for a long time and had witnessed these crimes. A group of the prisoners which I belonged to were placed to another basement that they planned to bombard with grenades at some future day. Our release became possible only because of the conflict between a leader of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, Plotnitsky, and the leader of the unit that was led by Batman, who planned to occupy this highest post in the so-called LPR. Leakage of the information about the mentioned crimes, also because of the combinations of confluence of circumstances that I can't describe because of lack of time, made it for me to become free. I was a prisoner for almost half a year. As I speak in such condition on the occupied territories, I kept hundreds of my compatriots, of my friends. I appeal to the progressive world not to forget about them. Thank you. Дякую.
And now we'll begin the first round of questions. Mr. Afanasyev, you were initially incarcerated in Crimea. What organization or who were the individuals who tortured you? And I understand that you were also tortured using electric shock. If you're able to, if you could describe some of the tortures that you underwent, and of course the first question, who were the individuals that were torturing you?
I was detained by FSB officers and former security officials of the Ukrainian Security Service. The torture was guided by the instructors from Moscow. And so they were guiding the torture process, but the actual torture were administered by the former SBU, Ukrainian Secret Service officials. And using electricity to my genitalia, they've used a damp cloth and they connected it to a live wire, and they were electrocuting me with it. That was excruciating, causing me excruciating pain. They would undress me, they would put me in different poses, threaten. They were threatening me to sexually assault me. They were showing me baton, police baton, and were telling me all the things that they will be doing it to me with this baton. And what would happen next with me when I will be brought back to a cell from other criminals in the cell?
We heard, this question is to Ms. Dovhan. We've heard that there are regular there is testimony quite regularly of sexual torture that takes place in the occupied territories. You alluded to this. How commonplace is sexual torture in those occupied territories?
At this point, I cannot provide any specific proof. I know about several facts of sexual violence. What people who used to live in my town, Isnavate, it was about 10 days ago. There is a department of traumatology in the hospital. There was a 17-year-old patient was taken. Her wrists and also I could see that her feet were also, there was some problems there, and probably the shoe was, her wrists were, as the traumatology specialist said, all the bones have become fragmented. He had never seen in the entire practice of his life, in all the experience, had never seen anything that cruel. This girl was brought and by the Vostok battalion, and she was x-rayed, and then another Kalmuz battalion took her back. I don't have any further details. What happened to that young girl? No one can say, no one knows. It's the latest case that I heard about, but I know there are quite a few cases like this.
Yesterday we heard from an official from the UNHCR that in 2015 there were an additional 800,000 internally displaced persons in Ukraine, and that's on top of 1 million internally displaced persons from 2014 when the Russian military invasions began. The small piece of land that's currently occupied in Donbass had a population about 5 million. Approximately 40% of the population is no longer there. What are the conditions that have led to and continue to lead to what appears to be the wholesale depopulation of the, I guess, ironically so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk?
Yeah.
What is causing this huge movement of hundreds of thousands of people?
Sure. Well, I think there are two answers to that question. As I recently told CNN, You know, I've worked in some of the worst places in the world. I don't know what put me on that spot, but for UNICEF, for example, I've been in Gaza and the West Bank. I've been to spots in Donetsk which seem even worse than Gaza in terms of destruction. It's that bad. As I catalog some of the infrastructure damage. And then the other thing that is happening is essential infrastructure isn't working in many places, including on both sides of the contact line. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, one of its roles, of course, is facilitation of access. So the mission has been working on a weekly basis to facilitate the access of repair workers on both sides of the contact line. This obviously takes a lot of coordination on both sides. And they have been able to repair a lot of crucial infrastructure, especially downed power lines, water mains, that sort of thing. But then what happens, shelling again occurs, and this infrastructure is downed once again. So I will table it with the clerk later, but the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission does have a thematic report on IDPs, and in there you'll find a lot of the catalog of infrastructure that has been damaged. The other aspect, of course, is the freedom of liberties, the erosion of freedom of liberties. Also, what is happening is what I call a creeping institutionalization by the rebel groups. For example, what they managed to do over the past few months is establish a new Russian curriculum in the schools, new business registration procedures. They've introduced the ruble, and they've switched to Moscow time zone. On the erosion of civil liberties, I cited the report recently from 5 days ago of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And what they said, it was quoted in the BBC, is that there's a climate of, quote unquote, pervasive impunity in eastern Ukraine, and very few people have been held accountable for a catalog of alleged summary executions. And the OHCHR says that some of the cases could amount to war crimes. So what does this mean for the, I won't go on too long, what does this mean for the people who have remained in the occupied regions? Well, a lot of them don't have a choice. They don't have the funds to go back, or many of them are disabled, or many of them just want to stay in their homes. We've met some elderly people who refuse to leave for government-controlled Ukraine. What they do, however, is they cross over regularly to the government side to collect pensions, to shop for groceries, to get money out of the ATM. Because remember, even banks, most of the banks are closed in the occupied territories, so they have to go back and forth at great risk of their lives. And the gentleman there also did mention that many of them have to wait hours or sometimes a couple of days to cross the contact line. So life, in short, to sum up, is terrible. As I've said, it's comparable to some of the most dire places on the planet. And this is, as I've said many times, is that the worst thing that could happen is if the international community, including Canada, averts its gaze from this humanitarian disaster.
Thank you. And a quick final question to Mr. Gulkin. Last week, I had the opportunity to sit down with Mr. Mustafa Jamiliev and Renat Chubarov, and they related that 18 Crimean Tatar leaders were once again arrested last week. And what they say is there's clearly a methodical and meticulous plan that appears to be put in place of ethnocide of the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you for the question. We mostly work with IDPs who reside on the government-controlled territories. So I think that Mr. Afanasyev may answer better to this question, whether he's willing to do so. So I've heard about that, but I won't be able to add something more than Mr. Chubarov and Mustafa Jamiliev actually briefed you. And what we've heard and from the Crimean field mission that indeed there is a deterioration of the situation vis-a-vis the Crimean Tatars in the peninsula. So that's like it's in general. It was like.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll now go to Mr. Soroya. Mr. Soroya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses coming out and speaking to us, especially for the 3 victims and our sympathy. I can speak for all Canadians. We are with you any day of the week. Michael here in the room here. Michael, is 2 years ago, there was no IDPs, and all of a sudden, few million. Unbelievable, unimaginable. The people sleeping in the shelter stations, I think you mentioned, and the idea they would never go home. They put the tears in your eye. And my heart beeps for these guys, for the people from the bottom of my heart. Michael, when you were observing in Ukraine that time, did you go through difficulties as an international observer? Can you speak to us on that topic?
Sure. Well, I'll be totally honest with you, and I don't think anything I'm saying has not been in our, for example, OSCE daily reports or weekly thematic reports. But one of the difficulties is freedom of access for the monitoring mission. And I must say this is happening on both sides of the contact line, the Ukrainian side and sides controlled by the rebels. But of course, much, much worse on the rebel side. As most of you know, the Minsk Accords require both sides to, for example, move heavy weaponry away from the contact line. There are prescribed distances that they should be removed. And then what happens, these heavy weapons are meant to be stored in monitored storage sites. Well, many times the special monitoring mission has been prevented from going to these storage sites to see if the weapons are still there. In fact, as we speak, over the past few weeks, there's been a gradual escalation of violence, and a big reason for that is that this heavy weaponry has been moved back into place and being used. The other thing is that there's been lots and lots of difficulties accessing the Ukraine-Russian border under rebel control. Believe it or not, the length of Ukrainian border under rebel control is almost 500 kilometers. That's more than the distance from here to Toronto. And on many occasions, the mission has been prevented from going to the border. And this is a problem especially at night because a lot of railway lines cross the contact line and no one really knows what types of materials are taken over. If I can speak from a personal point of view, maybe that was part of your question, but working there is very, very difficult. As I've said, I've worked in many places around the world, and the destruction you see, the psychosocial distress among many of the children, huge factor right now, is very, very bad. Do you know that some families in Donetsk have spent weeks in underground shelters without seeing any daylight, without breathing any fresh air? There's a town called Shirokina near Mariupol, and that has been shelled constantly. There's no one there now, but a lot of the residents spent weeks in a shelter there. So it's very difficult. Finally, we were, I should say that I mentioned MH17. I've just come back from Malaysia, by the way. I was there for the 2nd anniversary. The Special Monitoring Mission was the first international presence on the site of the plane crash. We were there 24 hours after that plane came down. I can tell you that the images we saw were absolutely horrific. We were threatened by armed rebel groups, some of them intoxicated, some of them in a very kind of vicious type of state of attitude. Yet, day after day, we did gain more access, and we were able to get experts there to deal with the site. But you know, on many occasions, we were blocked. We were blocked while we were trying to get Malaysians there, the Dutch investigators. And in fact, just quickly to wrap up, the Dutch have been trying to finish off their criminal investigation, but they have been blocked, especially in Luhansk, to do things like, for example, triangulate cell phone tower communications amongst the rebels. So It's a very, very difficult operating environment, but I'm glad that Canada is part of the mission to document what is going on and to facilitate access.
What would you like to see Canadian and the international society can help out? What sort of help would you need for the IDP, especially in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like Canada to continuing support to the Special Monitoring Mission. It plays a very, very crucial role. It's helped a great deal to alleviate suffering on both sides of the contact line. At the moment, I think we have almost 30 Canadian monitors there. I think we could go a bit higher, and also Canada should maintain, if not increase, its financial commitment to the OSC. It does very, very good work there. I did mention a couple of ideas there. You know, for example, encouraging the private sector to open up more internship opportunities for young Ukrainians, scholarship opportunities. I mentioned the visa problems. I understand this has been alleviated, but the reason I have been told that under the previous government that there was a visa clampdown was because that government believed that people from Donetsk and Luhansk were coming to Canada as visitors and overstaying. I don't think the actions of a few bad apples are a reason to have a blanket clampdown on visitor visas from Ukraine. If anything, now is the time to allow them more access to Canada. Finally, among that huge group of IDPs are a lot of professionals, journalists, IT experts, even fashion designers. And in fact, I had hoped to wear my Ukrainian-made suit today. It was designed by a fashion designer in Donetsk who is incarcerated, but Air Canada lost my baggage, so I couldn't wear my Ukrainian suit for you. You know, many professionals who, as I think all of us have indicated, have had problems seeking opportunities now that they have left their places of residence. So perhaps there could be a special temporary program in place to help IDPs, even from the professional class, to come to Canada to get to, you know, gain more experience and also, in a way, contributing to Canadian society. We have a domestic helper program for overseas worker program for Filipinos. It's targeting a special country. Why can't the same be made for Ukraine, at least on a temporary basis?
Absolutely. Thank you. My next question is for do we have time?
Very quickly.
Mr. Galkins, you are a director of a charity. It's called Right to Protection. From your side, what would you like to see Canadians, what can be helped, how can be helped from your charity point of view?
Sorry, I don't hear you. Would you please repeat the question?
You are a director of the Right to Protection Charity Fund, and what would you like to see Canada can help out from your side?
Thank you for your question. First of all, I think that now, after 2 years of the onset of the conflict, the situation with when it comes to the displaced population in Ukraine, so we should understand this is to some extent quite an unusual crisis, because it's mostly pensioner crisis, because mostly of IDPs are pensioners, 65%, and children 20 plus, and single mothers. So most of IDPs fall under the vulnerability criteria, and their integration is quite difficult when we have people, well-being people, so it's much easier to integrate them, and when we have some those who can sustain, it's young couples who actually moved early 2014, so they integrated on their own. The government did a little in order to help these people, and now, in addition to humanitarian assistance, which is of paramount importance, of course, to those who live on both sides, and in non-government control areas and the government control areas. There is a great need of integration efforts to be done, and they should be done in a holistic manner. And I think the Canadian government, it used to be CIDA. This time CIDA does not operate effectively in Ukraine, so there is direct aid from the government of Canada. So I think the government of Canada can consider
Thank you, Mr. Bell.
an increase of its help, support, plus, in terms of the civil society was the first responder to the crisis, and during these 2 years, the civil society usually took over many functions of the government in Ukraine. So the civil society also, and this is a very new civil society, a very let's say concept.
Mr. Chair, the last comment is for the victim, the third victim who spoke the last, Grushenko, his name is. I hoping the person who tortured you by the electric shocks, with among other ways, I'm hoping he will face the court in Hague one of these days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soroya. Ms. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for their presentation. My question is for you, Michael. In terms of action from Canada, you name off some items. There's been a lot of discussion, I guess, in the series of meetings that we've had about the internally displaced peoples. And one suggestion that's been brought forward is the former program that we had in Canada, the source country classification. I wonder whether or not if that is an option for consideration, and I wonder what your thoughts are with respect to that program and whether or not that would assist in this instance.
Honestly, I've been overseas for so long, I'm not that very familiar with the source country program, but does it allow kind of special status?
The source country category basically allows for people in their country of origin to make application without having to go through the UNHCR process or referral.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, it's a great idea. We do call them IDPs, but, basically these are refugees in their own country. I hate to say it, but it's looking more and more that this territory may not go back to Ukrainian control because of what the rebel side has done. They're digging in. It's looking like a frozen conflict now. And even if it were to return to the Ukrainian government, the reconstruction process would be in the billions of dollars range. And there would also have to be a massive kind of reconciliation process. So I personally would like to see that. As I said, among these IDPs are very, very, very many professionals. And they would be a contribution to the Canadian economy, to Canadian society, not a drain. And, we've seen how great a contribution the Syrian refugees have made already to Canada. So I think the same thing would happen. And, I've seen many examples where people from many countries have gone overseas to develop educational skills, work experience. They go back to their country and they make a huge difference. I'll give one final note because I think it needs to be said. And recently, as many of you know, there was a high-level Canada-Ukraine business forum in Toronto, and one of the big issues in Ukraine right now is endemic corruption. Young people, and I know a lot of them, it's not just anecdotal, have a tough time making a go. They've done all the right things, they've got a proper education, great upbringing, and yet they can't find a level playing field. Hence, even more reason for them to come to a place like Canada, gain those kind of values and work experience, educational experience, go back when the time is right and contribute to the rebuilding of Ukraine.
Thank you. And the other suggestion that you made was around a similar program like that of the domestic workers for the Philippines. So are you thinking about a temporary foreign workers type program then for the professionals, or are you more thinking about a immigration stream? Just sort of trying to get clarification.
I would like to see actually an immigration strategy. I've seen how the so-called new wave of Ukrainians have dealt with themselves here in Canada. They're doing very well. Boris for sure would know more about this than I do, but many of them are contributing solidly to the Canadian economy. And yes, that would be a good thing to do practically, economically, and I think it would also send a good signal to Ukraine. Our Canadian Prime Minister was recently in Ukraine. He had a very impressive visit, reiterated Canada's support for the country, and this would be sending a signal that, yes, we do support you. The door is open to come to Canada. I think the sooner that happens, the better.
And on the refugee stream, I'm wondering, are you considering more of a government-assisted refugee stream or privately sponsored refugee stream? In the other scenarios where we discussed this, in fact, I think pretty well all of the groups were suggesting a privately sponsored stream. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
You know, there's a huge Ukrainian diaspora community here in Canada. I think that if this were privately sponsored by families or whatever, by the community, that would work very, very well. There's huge resources in the Ukrainian community. It's one of the most, if not the most active Ukrainian diaspora communities in the world. So I think that this could be done without putting a strain on government resources. And you know, I've worked in the OSCE, so I'm pretty practical thinking, and I think from a kind of public perception point of view, it'd be much better that this be handled by Ukrainians, by families, and even non-Ukrainians who want to support Ukraine in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of numbers, do you have any sense of the kind of numbers that perhaps governments should be considering?
One thing I've learned in the OSCE is to not speculate, but I think because I'm no longer with them, I can do a little speculation. My guess, and this is entirely a guess, would be in the tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 plus. Again, Canada ranks very, very high in the Ukrainian psyche because of the support Canada has given, because of the visit by the Prime Minister. The other thing, just quickly, aside from providing opportunities for them to come here, either temporarily or permanently, would be Canada has historically played a very big role in, for example, development of the media sector in Ukraine. I neglected to mention that aside from journalists having to flee Donetsk and Luhansk, many of the media institutions in the areas previously occupied by the rebels, Sloviansk, for example, a lot of the newspapers, radio stations, TV stations were totally destroyed. So even though these areas are back in government control, there aren't sufficient resources for these outlets to get it up and running again. So perhaps the government could look at an assistance program through our aid arm to help Ukrainian journalists upgrade their skills, but also to put some of these media outlets back on stream.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so that would be through humanitarian aid.
Yeah, correct.
Directly.
Yeah.
So what else could Canada do, perhaps in conjunction with or in collaboration with the international community? What are other countries doing? And what are the opportunities to which Canada can work collaboratively with them? So I think international aid would be one aspect of it, along with the other streams. Yeah.
International aid, indeed. When I was in Kiev the last time, the signals I was getting from colleagues there, I won't name them, but was that a lot more money is needed in terms of development aid from Canada to Ukraine. I think that one of the areas where Canada could play a very leading role is, again, in this battle against corruption, in helping, for example, to train officials to deal with that sort of thing. Also, Canada has been active in terms of training police officials, border guards, that sort of thing. That needs to be maintained, if not increased. But it's really supporting those key institutions to develop to a level expected of a modern country. The other area where we have been very active, and by we mean Canada, where we cannot let go, is in the area of public health. And I'm sidetracking a bit, but because I have expertise in this area, I'm going to say it, is that, believe it or not, in areas controlled by the Ukrainian government, it has the lowest immunization rates of anywhere in the world, lower than Somalia, places like that. A lot of this has to do with corruption, but a lot of it has to do because there just isn't the expertise there to do things like procure childhood vaccines, that sort of thing. So Canada has contributed money for things like childhood vaccines, but it's the whole system that needs to be looked at and reformed. Finally, Canada has played a very key role. We have great ambassadors at the OSCE and in Ukraine in terms of participating in finding solutions to bring peace back to Ukraine. That's what everyone wants, of course, through participation in Vienna and the Minsk Accords, that sort of thing. That sort of participation needs to continue. We need to find a solution to this conflict because it's cost too many lives and displaced too many people.
Thank you. Mr. Virani, the next round is yours. It's a 7-minute.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone, to Michael, to everyone who's joining us from Mariupol and Kiev. I would say Duje Diaku, thank you very much for being here. My riding in Toronto is home to part of that diaspora that you were mentioning, Michael, and the country, as you've accurately indicated, is replete with a huge Ukrainian diaspora that dates for 125 years, that is very well integrated, very well established, very vocal. And they communicate to people like the chair, they communicate to people like myself about the concerns that they see on the ground. I wanted to start my questioning with asking you a bit about, we've heard a lot here today about the scope of the displacement. The sheer numbers are staggering, as Mr. Soraya outlined. You're looking at, in the span of 2 years, nearly 2 million people in movement. Can you describe to us a little bit about the movement of people leaving the Donbass and how far they are moving within the country and what impact that's having on local infrastructure and institutions in the rest of Ukraine?
Okay. Sure, great question. Well, the map shows where most of them have gone to, but of course most want to stay in areas close to the Donetsk and Luhansk. Many of them are Russian-speaking, so you find that in Oblast closest to the conflict zone, these are Russian-speaking areas. And also, that close proximity allows them to cross back and forth to, for example, check on their properties, agricultural lands, and so on. The problem is that many of these oblasts are becoming overwhelmed. In fact, as far back as 2014, the OSCE had reported that the capacity for NGOs, for civil society groups, for oblast governments to support IDPs was already running out. That was back in 2014. I don't mean to be too harsh on the Ukrainian government, but they were woefully unprepared for this massive upflow of people. Probably any government would, but it took a long time for them to get up to speed. I can tell you that in cities like Mariupol, also Dnipropetrovsk, where a lot of the IDPs have gone, they've basically said, no vacancy. We can't possibly support anymore. So it's very important for two things to happen. One is for collective centers where IDPs live to continue to be supported. And the other one is they need to be found permanent housing. A lot of them are there with their children, very little they brought with them. So that this integration process needs to happen more. The other thing I can tell you is that aside from housing needs, I mentioned the lack of civil documentation, that the political rights are also going to be important if they're going to stay in areas controlled by the Ukrainian government. Elections are coming up, so they need to be part of that as well. And then finally, I think a lot has been said already about their mobility crossing back and forth over the contact line. Aside by being held up for hours or overnight by both sides at checkpoints, there's also the threat of, if you're stationary along the contact line, a lot of shelling happens. So you're really putting this massive number of people in danger. I believe over any given month, as many as 100,000 people, civilians, cross back and forth over the contact line. And aside from the shelling, you also have the threat of landmines. And neither side has lived up to their full commitment to put signage to warn that there are landmines present. This is a responsibility that they have to take upon themselves.
So if I could ask both, perhaps you, Michael, and also Mr. Galkin in Mariupol, about this point you were making about sort of what I would call supports for civil society. Given that you've indicated that there's a situation where perhaps, unfortunately, the facts on the ground will not change and people will not be returning to the Donbass, they'll either stay in Ukraine or they will be resettled elsewhere. You mentioned a couple of things, and one of the things that's been communicated to me, for example, on the health front, you mentioned public health, is there are people from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that have come to me and said we need to support the displacement that is occurring because of the war against Russian separatists, with supports, for example, connecting facilities in Canada with facilities in Ukraine, such as medical supports, training for occupational and physical therapists. This has been suggested to me by Renata Roman of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. So you mentioned media, but is there also an avenue to bridge not just the students, and I'll come back to the students, but also the faculties and academics here in Canada with their counterparts in Ukraine to help build up some of that civil society infrastructure? So if you could perhaps address that, and also...
I'll be brief so the other person can also speak. Civil society, it's easy to be very critical of Ukraine. However, there are bright lights, and of course one of those is civil society, very, very strong civil society. It continues to thrive in Ukraine. However, they do need support because resources are very scarce in some areas. In terms of that international connection, especially with Canada, I think that's very important. Our ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Vashruk, when I sat with him last time, outlined some of the cooperation areas that exist. And one of them, for example, is between Toronto Sunnybrook Hospital and Children's Hospital in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And that has helped a great deal in terms of boosting that hospital's capacity to operate. As I already mentioned, media is another area, but there are, IT is a big one. The problem we have here in Canada is that we have great ideas, we create great IT firms, but then what happens is they can't raise money for second stage financing or growth. And guess what? They end up going to the United States. But I would like to see if there are areas in the IT sector to explore which could help our Canadian IT companies to survive and thrive even more. Many areas to explore. I don't think this is only the role of the government. Perhaps there could be a way to encourage the private sector to support this. And I, for example, have encouraged my own premier, Christy Clark, to think about doing a provincial trade mission to Ukraine to explore such ties. And I think other provincial governments should do likewise.
And I think the concluding of the trade agreement will help in that regard. But Mr. Galkin, if you could address this point about supporting civil society to raise awareness about what's going on in Ukraine, perhaps assisting with institutions in Canada, assisting institutions in Ukraine. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that, thank you for the question, and my vision is that, first of all, the civil society is badly needing some support, technical support, because most of the support coming from the international donors end up with either international organizations or UN organizations. So, and then most of the civil society actually is a little bit blocked from support. For instance, the humanitarian country team is composed of international organizations and UN organizations. So civil society actually needs some skills. So it needs to be trained in, for instance, when we speak about information, media and information. So most of these grassroots organizations do not have any idea even how to convey their messages to the targeted audiences. And for instance, in terms of media, so I think also there is a great need in an information strategy for the government, which does not have any strategy how to compose messages about IDPs and how to improve the overall understanding of to raise awareness of IDPs among the population. In terms of health, psychosocial assistance is still in a great need, and there are actors.
Thank you, Mr. Galkin.
There are actors who do that.
Ms. Rimpel, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I actually would like to carry on the stream of questioning around supporting infrastructure, civil society infrastructure, or just general infrastructure, social infrastructure in Ukraine to assist with some of these issues. Canada has been assisting in Ukraine through Op Unifor for a while. I know that we've assisted through this mission in training Ukrainian troops in areas of explosive ordnance and disposal, military police training, medical training, flight safety training, logistics modernization. Has this exercise, has this operation been useful in terms of improving the lives of civilian Ukrainians?
It's a very good question. I think that I'm not only talking about Ukraine, but many of the countries I've worked in, especially for UNICEF, this types of assistance takes a long time to actually show itself, to materialize. The important thing is that we don't look at short-term gains, but long-term gains. Again, I mentioned the C word, corruption in Ukraine, and I think there Canada can assist on two levels. One, of course, is the political pressure. In order for corruption to really disappear in Ukraine or to be diminished, if we can put it that way, political pressure needs to be leveraged. I'm not sure the Prime Minister brought it up during his recent visit, but Joe Biden sure did let the Ukrainians know that they need to deal with it in his previous visit. And the other one is the practical, the training, supporting organizations that monitor corruption, that monitor civil liberties is very, very important. But I do mention this because, you know, a lot of countries can spend a lot of money on training, that sort of thing. But if this pervasiveness, this attitude of corruption continues, these gains will be hard to realize, I'm afraid to say. And I'm using this, this observation comes from what I've seen in other countries as well. I think that our embassy in Ukraine, especially under Ambassador Vashchuk, has done a really, really good job in terms of kind of mapping out and exploring how we can get the best bang for our buck in Ukraine. And for example, he's talked a lot about that thriving IT sector, especially in Western Ukraine, which actually are doing business with some world-class companies, including Canadian Tire, believe it or not. So we need to help these sectors, again, survive and thrive as much as we can.
So just with the time I have remaining, do you think it's worthwhile? I know that the Op Unifor will be up for renewal in 2017. Do you believe that this is useful and that the Canadian government should extend this mission? You know, you spoke about it taking time to see the results of this type of initiative. Would your recommendation be to extend the mission? Yeah,
absolutely. I think our assistance to Ukraine has been very targeted, that we don't just take a broad-based approach. So I think from everything I've seen, we've targeted sectors that hold a lot of promise, and this includes, again, that IT sector, because there are so many Ukrainians that have expertise. I'll give you a quick example. This was at the Canada-Ukraine Business Forum on display, but it's the only one of its kind in the world. But there's a company in Western Ukraine that has actually developed an interactive table for restaurants, for customers can come and order goods, they can build their menus and that sort of thing. In fact, the Prime Minister was giving a test drive when he was in Toronto. The problem is that they don't have the capacity to seek seed funding or more funding to hit that global market. So I think perhaps that's another area where we can have bang for our buck. So you spoke about corruption. And obviously this is a very important issue with regard to Canada's relationship with Ukraine.
Before the 2015 federal election, motions calling for the government of Canada to adopt Magnitsky legislation and sanctions were unanimously adopted by the House of Commons. There's legislation before the House right now. Do you think it's important for Canada to send a unified, strong message in this particular regard to deal with some of the issues that you mentioned?
I think that we have to be very strong in speaking with the government, not only the government of Ukraine or other governments too, where corruption is a big problem. I'm not going to name names, you know what the countries are, but this is something that for some reason doesn't seem to go away very easily. It's endemic in the judiciary, law enforcement, a whole number of areas. Now, we have to remember too that this culture of corruption is something that is probably mostly a legacy of Soviet times. These things are not easy to brush away. But I think by now, we're so far into the administration of President Poroshenko that more concrete results could have been seen. I should mention just briefly...
Just with my time remaining, though, if you could comment specifically on the Magnitsky legislation and Canada's support for that, specifically to that.
Which is tied with seeing improvements. Well, I think if legislators feel that all political levers have been expended, then you need to look at other tools to get a government to act toward, adhere to international standards. I'm not a big advocate of that type of tool, but if it's seen that if we feel that we've expended all other avenues, then that should be done. And just very quickly, I'm sorry I forgot to mention this. The other big role Canada has played, of course, is in election observation missions. It's very important that we continue to have the resources and make our people available to monitor the conduct of elections throughout Ukraine.
I'm just wondering
Thank
if
you.
any... Oh, sorry. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Mr. Sassi, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone for appearing before this committee. It's been very helpful, focusing on various aspects of the situation in the Ukraine and how Canada can best assist. But I wanted to pick up where, Michael, you touched on the culture of pervasive impunity. And you were noting how a variety of international organizations are saying that the situation there is verging on war crimes. And of course, we've heard from witnesses who have recounted the atrocities they've been subjected to. And of course, this brings us to the amazing work that you're doing in terms of monitoring the situation, in terms of cataloging all the atrocities that have been going on for 2 years. The issue is transitional justice. Do you think that transitional justice does have a role to play? Is that something that, given our Canadian know-how, something that we should be supporting? Especially given that there has been a cataloging of atrocities, one would think that we have to put it to good use. Of course, we can't use the European Court of Human Rights, but there must be other avenues which should be explored and considered. And of course, I say that because unless there is some accountability, there is some semblance of justice, this whole concept of reconciliation will never take place. So what are your views on the scope of transitional justice and the best means to achieve that?
Well, first of all, I have to be very careful what I say, because even though I'm not with the Special Monitoring Mission, I do have former colleagues still very active there. And, there's a limit to what I can say for safety, security considerations. In terms of, you mentioned reconciliation, as this huge community of IDPs stays in their host communities longer and longer, and by the way, a lot of them have also gone to Western Ukraine, and people in Lviv, for example, have done a marvelous job in terms of hosting them and accepting them and welcoming them. However, there may come a time where some sort of reconciliation process needs to be put into place to help different sides reconcile their differences. The other thing that Canada should be supporting or encouraging the government to do is, I think it was already in 2014, is there were a series of roundtables around Ukraine that took place, and people from both sides were invited to speak there. And I thought they were very, very useful. I think about 4 or 5 took place, and then for some reason the government dropped the idea. But this sort of process, rotating roundtables where people from different sides can speak and talk about their differences and how we can move forward, are very, very important to do.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Galkin, if I could ask you about the prospects for transitional justice and how Canada can contribute on that front. Mr. Galkin?
The justice in the interim period. You mean how? Just would you please specify the question, if you don't mind?
Yes, there are a number of different organizations that have been very active on the ground, trying to make sure, to the best of their abilities, to catalog all the atrocities that are taking place. And many are of the view that transitional justice is something that should be taken very, very seriously. And I was wondering whether you were familiar with that area, and given the impediments that are there for the European Court of Human Rights to get involved, whether there were any other alternatives you could think of.
If you're speaking about, for instance, Amnesty International reports last year about inhumane treatments of from the both sides of the conflict. So we believe that, for instance, Ukraine is supposed to sign the Roma Statute in order to be able just to also to be responsible responsible signatory of the side of this conflict as well. And but you know that the government actually is not very much willing to do that. And also, actually within the society there is a quite a negative attitude towards these reports, because they actually divulge some negative and undermine some mythology of the Ukrainian government. So I believe that this justice for interim period should be very much supported, and it should also the Canadian government should also consider how to lobby or to advocate for the government for the implementation of justice for the government of Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for their testimony, for their insights. I'd like to particularly thank the 3 witnesses from Kyiv who suffered horrific atrocities while incarcerated in those militarily invaded territories of Ukraine. Thank you so much. And we will now suspend for 2 minutes to allow the next panel to appear. Welcome back. Appearing before us for the second panel today are Ms. Chantal Desloges from Desloges Law Group, Ms. Janet Dench from the Canadian Council for Refugees, who's appearing by video conference from Montreal, and appearing from Winnipeg by video conference is Mr. Brian Dick, Chair of the Canadian Refugee Sponsorship Agreement Holder Association. Welcome, and we'll begin with Ms. Desloges. 7 minutes, please, for your opening statement.
Thank you very much for the invitation to address you today, and thank you all for giving up your time in your constituencies this summer to look at this really important issue. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer. I've been working in this field in one capacity or another since 1994. I'm certified by the Law Society of Upper Canada as a specialist in refugee law and also a specialist in immigration law. In general, Canada has a refugee resettlement program that is the envy of the world. There are many countries today that are looking at our resettlement program as a model and thinking about how to adopt various aspects of it for themselves. We are doing really, really well in this regard, and I'm really proud of us, but I think that we can always do things better. What do I think are the chief problems when it comes specifically to minority communities? Well, first of all, internally displaced persons are completely left out of our Canadian resettlement program. This has to do with the definition legally of what is a convention refugee, both internationally and in our domestic law. It requires someone to be outside of their country of nationality in order to initiate a claim. And this concept, of course, harkens back to the time when the convention was drafted in 1951, which was post-World War II, which is a very, very different type of conflict than the types of things that we see today. The second issue has to do with a lot of the minority, very vulnerable communities are located physically in areas which are either literally inaccessible safely or at least inaccessible or not covered by the UNHCR. And the problem this creates is tied to the fact that we have basically wholesale subrogated our refugee selection to the UNHCR. The UNHCR is a wonderful organization. I admire it very much. However, they do have their own limitations, which they themselves will freely admit. And frankly speaking, Canadians didn't elect them in order to make these kinds of decisions as to what's best for us. The UNHCR simply doesn't and cannot have a presence everywhere in the world where they're needed, and they're hampered by their own logistical and financial concerns. They also do not have a mandate over internally displaced persons. So again, the group of IDPs is completely left out in the cold. I've read the written deputation which has been sent to the committee by Rainbow Railroad. They are experiencing the same frustrating experiences as many of the other witnesses before you earlier today and yesterday described as well, with respect to long delays in processing time by the UNHCR and often living in dangerous conditions while waiting for years to get a UNHCR appointment. May I say also that I think the best thing that we can do for vulnerable minorities all over the world is to eradicate ISIL, whatever it takes. That should be a top priority for our society. On a more immediate level, however, and specifically the immigration context, there are domestic steps that we can take. For example, relieving private sponsors of much of the red tape that now binds them up. That would free the sponsorship communities to help the people that they want to help. And this has worked very well in past years with specific communities, whether religious, sexual orientation, or ethnic. Allow Canadians to decide for themselves who they want to sponsor, and allow Canadians to put their money where their mouth is and to back it up with finances. Caps on private sponsorships for the sponsorship agreement holders are also a major problem. Not only the existence of the caps, but the unpredictability of those caps, which do not allow sponsorship agreement holders from year to year to know how many people they're going to be able to sponsor. It also, I think, makes sense to draw certain distinctions between groups of people, not in order to discriminate against those who are not prioritized, but to recognize the simple reality that some groups are singled out, and they are horrifically targeted by their persecutors. If the persecutors themselves draw those distinctions, it only makes sense that our response has to be proportionate. Every refugee faces a well-founded fear of persecution, but not every refugee is a genocide victim. Not every refugee is a survivor of sex slavery. So we're talking about apples and oranges. True equality doesn't always mean treating people exactly the same. Sometimes we have to treat groups differently in order to make them equal. All refugees need protection, but not all of them need permanent resettlement. Some of these minority groups will never be able to go home even after the war is over. And this is unlike many of the current displaced groups who will be able to go home once the war is over. For example, a lot of the Muslim majority will be able to go home and will in fact want to go home. We need to also be asking ourselves very serious questions about why many of the neighboring Arab countries, some of whom are very wealthy, are not doing more to take protection over their own co-religionists and people who share a similar culture and background. A very small minority of Middle Eastern countries are shouldering more than their fair share of that burden. The error of the previous government was not acting fast enough and not acting on a large enough scale to respond to the Middle East refugee crisis. The numbers that were admitted overall were comparatively small. Most of those were privately sponsored, with very few government assisted, and with very long processing times. What are the legal and administrative tools available to us to alleviate some of these problems that are facing us? First of all, increased use of the humanitarian and compassionate provisions in Section 25 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to cover off situations where people are not outside their country of origin, for example, internally displaced people. Also, people who do not have UNHCR recognition. So that would cover people who are not able to, for whatever reason, to access UNHCR registration or to access UNHCR camps. I'll give you an example. I had 2 or 3 files in which I had previously requested Section 25 H&C discretion from the Immigration Department, and the processing office in Winnipeg had absolutely no clue how to handle a request like that in the context of a sponsorship for a refugee. It was unbelievable to me that that could have been the case, but it was the case. They did not know how to handle it. Statutory discretion. And for this reason, I think that if we're going to use Section 25 more liberally, then there's going to have to be a specific directive written to visa officers and immigration officers inland on how to exercise that discretion and what are the proper parameters of it. Secondly, lift or at least better manage the caps on sponsorship agreement holders. Private sponsors are really excited right now, and they're willing to back up their enthusiasm with their wallets. So I say let them loose. Let them sponsor however many they're prepared to financially support. In addition, waiving interviews for groups like the Yazidis who testified this morning. Why not waive their interviews with Canadian immigration? Everyone knows that they're refugees. They're prima facie refugees. They really only need to pass their security and medical screening. Why are we interviewing every single one of them? Not only is it creating backlogs, but it also creates a situation where it's difficult to send Canadian visa officers into these various areas without a risk to their security. I actually raised this in an interview not that long ago with IRCC personnel, and I was told that, well, you know, we can't waive the interviews because we have to interview them for security, which didn't really make sense to me because every immigrant to Canada under every category has to pass a security check. And the vast majority of people who immigrate to Canada do not have to do a personal interview for a security check. That doesn't make sense. When I proposed, well, perhaps the interviews could be done by Skype or by video conference, I was told that no, that was not suitable because it wouldn't allow someone to judge their credibility properly, which is interesting because there are refugee claims in Canada. Many of them are adjudicated by video conference. So why is it okay for inland claims, but it's not okay for outside Canada claims? This could alleviate a lot of the backlog. And finally, I think more systematic use of temporary resident permits under Section 24 of IRPA for urgent cases involving immediate risk. TRPs are sometimes issued, but I find that they're issued very sparingly, and perhaps a more liberal use of that particular vehicle would be very helpful. Reports about attacks on Yazidi communities, for example, first came out in August 2014. And in conjunction with the Office for Refugees, Archdiocese of Toronto, who I believe testified yesterday, and One Free World International, who I believe will testify tomorrow, I helped to draft a proposal to CIC. This was in early 2015 under the previous government. That proposal was to do with a project for resettlement, a small-scale project for women survivors of sex slavery from ISIS in the minority Yazidi community. My expertise was strictly on the legal side. I know nothing about the logistics of such things. No action was taken on that proposal, despite numerous follow-ups. And that proposal was again renewed when the new government came into power with the new minister. And again, no action was taken on that despite several follow-ups. The only time that proposal got any attention was after this last sitting of this committee in which these similar issues were discussed. So it appears that that now is on the right track, and I just want to say thank you to the committee and congratulate you on your work because it is making a difference.
Thank you. Ms. Dislosh. Next, Ms. Janet Dench. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am here today to represent the Canadian Council for Refugees, which is an umbrella organization with about 180 member organizations, many of which are heavily involved in resettlement. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you for putting the focus on vulnerable refugees. Canada's resettlement program should be designed to respond effectively to vulnerable refugees globally. At times in its history, Canada has used economic criteria to select refugees for resettlement, which is not appropriate. The immigration regulations still require that those resettling to Canada be able to successfully establish in Canada. A couple of comments about internally displaced persons. While refugees by definition have fled their country of origin, IDPs are displaced within their own country. This distinction is more than just one of geography. From a legal perspective, those who are outside their country need to rely on the international community, whereas someone within their country is entitled to expect that their own government will protect them. For this reason, IDPs are not generally considered for resettlement, which is a solution for people who need some other country to provide protection and a permanent home. International law, in fact, assumes that people facing persecution will seek protection within their own country if they can reasonably do so. Refugee claimants in Canada are regularly asked to explain why they could not have gone somewhere else in their country to escape persecution, known as the internal flight alternative. In some cases, of course, IDPs do not enjoy the protection of their home government because the government is unwilling or unable to provide protection. In such cases, the person may need international protection, but it is because of the lack of protection available, not because they are displaced. Currently, Canada's immigration regulations exclude from resettlement anyone still in their country of origin. This was not always the case. Before October 2011, Canada had a source country class. This class provided for resettlement of people still in their country of origin. The CCR recognizes that there are a number of challenges in using resettlement to respond to people still in their country of origin, including political and diplomatic issues with the source country, security issues for Canadian officials processing the case and for those being processed, and serious problems in identifying an organization that can do referrals, given that this is not part of the UNHCR mandate. However, the CCR opposed the elimination of the source country class. We wanted to reform it to make it work, and we maintain that position. A comment now about equity. CCR, of course, shares the horror felt by the committee over the human rights abuses suffered by the Yazidis, as well as by many other religious and ethnic minorities. At the same time, we need to be careful about targeting specific groups, as it can compromise equitable treatment. Often there are individuals at extreme risk who do not fit a specified group, but are just as deserving of priority consideration. We should not say to someone at risk that you won't be considered for resettlement simply because of your religion or ethnicity. In this regard, we note the dishonorable recent history of Canada trying to force a bias in referrals from UNHCR. The principle of non-discrimination is a fundamental one and must be scrupulously respected. The issue of equity is of particular concern for the CCR and its members at present in the context of the current focus on Syrian refugees. Many individuals and institutions are generously reaching out to support Syrian refugees. As welcome as that is, when the benefits are directed only to Syrians, there is an injustice to other refugees. In particular, Canada's resettlement response has not been good to African refugees. As a result, we believe it is important to design policies and programs that are equitable to all refugees globally without targeting particular nationalities or ethnic groups. We also have concerns about the politicization of the refugee selection system. We need to avoid having decisions made based on which groups have the best lobbyists or the best access to the minister's ear, or which groups catch the media's interest. We note the rise in recent years of ministerial priorities in the private sponsorship program, which we considered very problematic. The UNHCR has the mandate to identify vulnerable groups for resettlement. We recommend letting the UNHCR take the lead. This does not exclude having open consultations about Canada's resettlement plans in dialogue with the UNHCR. Now, a word about the Urgent Protection Program. Sometimes vulnerable refugees need very quick resettlement. Canada has an urgent protection program which should allow Canada to respond to vulnerable refugees facing imminent protection threats. However, sometimes Canada struggles to meet the timelines for the program. We would like to see the government use the successful experience of doing rapid processing of Syrian refugees in order to find ways to move refugees very quickly when there are urgent protection needs. Now to mention other immigration measures. Canada can respond to human rights crises by opening up immigration possibilities that are not strictly tied to the refugee category. This can reduce some of the legal and diplomatic issues. For example, the CCR has been recommending that Canada offer temporary resident permits to Syrians with family in Canada. Finally, a word about alternatives to resettlement. Canada can play an important role in ways other than resettlement to support IDPs and refugees. The UN report on Yazidis has a series of recommendations, and in fact resettlement is not one of them. Governments can and do engage diplomatically, provide funding, and advocate for the rights of IDPs and others, and respond in other ways. Since our organization's expertise is in the area of immigration, which is also this committee's mandate, we do not pretend to have specific recommendations to make, but many NGOs are engaged in these issues and can give input. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dench. And now we move on to Mr. Dick. Mr. Dick, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this invitation to speak to this committee. The Canadian Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association is a group of about 100 sponsorship agreement holders, or SAWs as we call ourselves, who facilitate the application process and settlement of most of the private sponsored refugees who arrive in Canada. For the most part, SAWs respond to people who come to our doors, and that makes our work slightly different than what the government is doing. Typically, our selection process involves working with someone in our community who is worried about friends or relative who is a refugee and so we're not looking at the global needs structure. We're looking at what's in front of us. Though the refugee resettlement pie is much bigger this year, and we're very thankful for that, it's bigger than it's been in a long time, many SAWs worry about that slice being carved off and parts of it being lost to us. This is a worry because of the restrictive caps on new sponsorship applications for SAWs that have been part of our environment since 2012. As you know, the caps were brought in to deal with the long wait times and backlogs of applications, which were indeed a problem. Because African visa offices were the most oversubscribed places, these caps have impacted African sponsorships particularly hard as they deal with many old cases there. Between 2012 and 2015, my rough estimate is that about 2,000 Africans were sponsored to come to Canada. By comparison, last year alone, SAWs were able to submit almost 10,000 Syrian and Iraqi sponsorships, and that doesn't include what was done in Quebec, because I don't have those numbers, because they were prioritized, and there was no cap on those two populations in 2015. Prioritizing one group necessarily has an impact on the whole Canadian resettlement system and can cause problems elsewhere. While no one wants to get into the morbid science of comparing one refugee's plight to another, there are many who wonder why someone who has been waiting for more than 5 years may need to continue to wait while others appear to be zipping through the process because they're prioritized. There are certainly compelling reasons why some refugees need to be resettled on an urgent basis, and Canada already has a system for that, the Urgent Protection Program that's been talked about. However, as a rule, SAWs want to see applications processed in the order that they came into the system to see equal access to sponsorships from around the world. That's why I think it's important to focus on building a robust refugee resettlement system that can handle the ongoing demands and at the same time respond to the urgent protection situations that come up. That's something that we that will take careful building and planning to put resources where they're needed and to realize the efficiencies. In terms of resettling internally displaced people, Canada, of course, had a unique program to deal with this a number of years ago called the Source Country Class, which was talked about already. While many were resettled to Canada over the years through this program, there were a number of problems which have been highlighted. There was limited to a few countries that were available. Embassies designated were often difficult to or even dangerous to access, and many people who applied did not qualify, so rejection rates were high. I work for Mennonite Central Committee, and we as MCC were somewhat involved in source country sponsorship in Colombia because we have had a program working with IDPs for many years in that country. Generally, our programs were focused on helping IDPs find new life within Colombia because most of the time that moving away from the threat that was facing these IDPs eliminated the threat. The threat did not follow them. If, however, they continued to get death threats, we tried to walk with them in the process and apply for resettlement in some cases. For a number of reasons, we never did very much of that. Our first option was always local integration because that's what worked the best. We knew that it wasn't easy to resettle, and for most people, displaced people, that's not what they want. They don't want to go to a place like Canada. They want to stay closer to where they are. Also, we knew that it was the key focus, that it would be dangerous. If this was a key focus for us, it would be dangerous for our staff and for the people in the churches that were involved in this. And we were also beginning to see more fraud as people began to see this as a way to get to Canada. So there were problems with that. I think if Canada embarks on a program like that, I think it would be important for us to think about how to deal with this selection process in a way that's safe and effective and fair. And that's not going to be a simple thing to figure out. Finally, I think it's important to keep in mind that resettlement is but one tool in our toolbox in responding to forced displacement. I note that the report that this committee referred to from the UN does not mention resettlement in its recommendations. The focus instead is on trauma healing and rebuilding of the communities. Mennonite Central Committee has worked in the Middle East, including in Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and in Syria itself for decades. Our partners of all faiths on the ground are not really talking to us about resettlement. When we ask them what is best for them to do, the response is along the lines of, help us to reach out to our neighbors who are in need. That involves development work, and more importantly, involves working at relationship buildings in this community. In Iraq, for example, our partners work with Yazidis and Christians and other groups on trauma healing, which extends across religious boundaries. In Syria, thanks to grants from the Office of Religious Freedoms, we have seen Christians and Muslims working together on relief and development projects and even stand up for each other in the face of violence. These are small steps, but those can be the seeds of peace in a place of conflict that is often imported into the region. I know that there are many forgotten groups around the world, and this committee has been hearing from them, and to hear the plight of those people is a very important thing. But it would be difficult to decide who to help when we cannot help everyone. Many of us who are SAWs struggle with this on a daily basis, and it's the hardest thing that we do on a regular basis, to decide where we can help and where we can't. We as SAWs handle this a number of ways, and we do what we can. Stepping back for a minute from the SAW world, it's important to have a global discussion on how best to use the limited number of spaces for resettlement that are available each year from various states, and to use them well. As you think about recommendations, it will be important for you to think not just of the people that come to you with these compelling stories, as important as they are, but how that resettlement in combination with other efforts to work with victims of forced displacement can work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dick. Ms. Zaid, 7 minutes, please.
I want to take this opportunity to thank all our witnesses for providing their input today and for all the work which they are doing in settling the new immigrants to this country. My first question is for Ms. Chantal Dessler. Sponsorship, as we all know, that sponsorship agreement holders can identify the refugees they want to sponsor, and which is one way for those not prioritized by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and IRCC to be resettled in Canada. What, in your opinion, is the right balance between the privately sponsors and the government-assisted refugees, and what percentage of the total level of immigrants you think is the right for the refugees?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a big fan of the private sponsorship of refugees program, and less so with government-assisted refugees, although I do think that government-assisted refugees do have their place in our program. If it were up to me, I would much more heavily weight towards private sponsorship, simply because the demand is so great right now, and there's really no downside risk for Canadian society or Canadian taxpayers. As to an overall percentage, I don't feel really qualified to say what should be the total mix of refugees versus economic class or family class immigration. I really hesitate to comment on that.
So you are more inclined towards the privately sponsors in the total mix of the...
I am.
Refugees.
I am. I think if the government is going to spend money, the government should spend money towards helping private sponsors do the wonderful work that they're already doing.
And the government-assisted refugees are usually considered to be more vulnerable. So what is your opinion about that?
Well, like I said, I wouldn't say that you should totally eliminate government-assisted refugees. I think that possibly for smaller projects, targeted projects for specific groups of people maybe would be a good idea. But I wouldn't say that government-assisted refugees are necessarily more vulnerable than privately sponsored ones. Just the privately sponsored ones have more local Canadian support, I would say, after their arrival.
And how does the internationally accepted legal definition of refugees, which requires someone to have crossed an international border, complicate the ability of the international community to provide assistance to the internally displaced people?
Yes, that's a huge problem. I think in terms of IDPs, that's our #1 legal challenge in that department. I would really hesitate to tinker with the definition of refugee, which has stood in good stead for such a long time. I think rather than think about changing those things, we should focus on not reinventing the wheel. I mean, using Section 25 to exempt people from that requirement in the right circumstances would achieve the same thing without requiring legislative overhaul. But I do think you're right to identify that as it's a very significant problem for IDPs.
Is there any other country you know who has done that?
I'm not aware of that.
My next question is for the Canadian Council for Refugees. Since yesterday, we have heard about some of the groups in our study for the people who are vulnerable. But with your broader perspective and the number of people you deal with, could you outline different groups of the internally displaced people around the world, and what are the challenges those groups are facing?
There's a very large number of people who are internally displaced, and they do tend to be forgotten in various different ways. It's a complicated business to respond to internally displaced people, and their situation in some countries can be particularly vulnerable because they are within their own borders, and if their own government is unwilling or unable to protect them, then it's difficult also for the international community. The UN obviously cannot just walk into any country and act as it wishes. It has to have the approval of the government of that particular country. So there was a period when the UNHCR was really putting a lot of focus on internally displaced people, and there was, I think, a bit of an effort internationally to try to find some solutions to those problems. However, then it sort of seemed to go a bit off the agenda. I believe that the new High Commissioner is wanting to push it back and to get more attention, and I think that if the Canadian government was willing to play a leadership role diplomatically to really try to address some more attention to finding feasible solutions for internally displaced people, that would be a terrific contribution that Canada could make.
You know, like, resettlement is not the only solution based on the resources. What as an international community we can do other than the resettlement to help the internally displaced people?
Yes, well, I think that the Canadian government is engaged in terms of funding, for example. There's a lot of reliance by IDPs on support from the international community, which Canada can contribute and does contribute to and could do more. As I say, there's ways of engaging diplomatically, playing a role in discussions locally and with other governments and with UN agencies to say, well, in different circumstances, what are some of the solutions that could be found for people? There's also a question of highlighting the protection needs, because of course the concerns for IDPs is whether or not their rights are being properly protected. So Canada can both directly raise those issues, encourage the host government to respect people's rights, but it can also support local people, IDPs themselves, who organize themselves in order to draw attention to the ways in which their rights are not being respected. So that's another way that Canada can provide some support.
20 seconds. That's it. Ms. Rempel, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I might just use some time to make a few comments because we've had so much testimony in the last couple of days. I can accept criticism on our government's approach. I'm happy to do that. What I can say is that we did our best in terms of, I think it was right to say that we were going to put a focus on vulnerable, persecuted, and ethnic minorities. I don't accept the testimony that we just heard here that we shouldn't be doing that. I think it's very easy for us to become bogged down in bureaucracy and realize that we have to act quickly in certain situations. It would be very difficult for someone not to be moved by the testimony that we heard from people in Ukraine, from Nadia Murad today, and realize, Ms. Deloge, to your comment, that while there are situations where people are affected, everyone is affected, there are people who are affected more. So I can accept criticism. If the government can realize that they need to act and change their testimony, I'm putting that on the table to or change their position. I was on a television panel many months ago with one of the members who are in this room, and I remember discussing, he had made a comment saying that we make no bones that we're treating Syrian refugees differently. But when pressed on what the criteria was for why, couldn't respond. And I think that that's where the government has an opportunity here. I think we do need to treat certain cohorts differently so that we can respond quickly to needs. That's not saying that somebody's case is more or less valuable, but there are situations, as we've heard from many disparate groups with many disparate political affiliations today, that we need to act. So I think that that's very important, and I think that that's something that we've heard loud and clear. I think we need to have clear criteria for when we are acting in those situations. So, the comment, not all groups can go home afterwards. I think that that's absolutely valid. I think that when we've got a declaration of genocide, that's very clear. And I find it, just for some of the witnesses who said that the UN report doesn't deal with resettlement, it's completely false. On page 39, paragraph 212G, the UN itself asks us to accelerate the asylum applications of Yazidis. And in my understanding, and we have legal experts here who might clarify, but my understanding is an asylum claimant is someone seeking to have seeking asylum, and a refugee is someone who's had a successful asylum claim. So to say that it doesn't do that, I think is just crazy and missing the point of the whole report. The comments around bias of referrals, I certainly don't want to see our refugee process politicized either. But I think that we need to ensure that the principle of helping people that, for example, today are facing genocide needs to be enshrined in our immigration system when it comes to refugees. So, I'll just very briefly ask for some comments. There's been much raised about the source, the source class. I think that's what it's called. And I know in 2012, when Section 25 of the Immigration Act, Section 25(2), was implemented, it was done so in response to the fact that we heard from the community that the source country class was not nimble or flexible enough, or didn't offer the minister enough immediate authority to go in and help people. The criticism on how do we operationalize that, I think that's valid. I think that the government has an opportunity here to direct the department on how to do that, and I'd love to get feedback on that as well too. The comment as well around, and I know I'm burning all of my time, Mr. Chair.
So perhaps maybe we could start with...
But I can use my time for how I feel it. The other thing that I'd like to see is an examination of us actually. The government has imposed right now a cap or an exemption from the cap that was previously there for Iraqi nationals. I think given the designation of genocide by the United Nations and the minister's admission that this is actually happening, this is an opportunity for the government to do some of these things. So, you know, Ms. Desloge, with the amount of time that I have left, I think I have a couple of minutes left, I was just wondering if you could provide some additional feedback or clarity on some of the comments that I've just made.
I have made some notes while my colleagues were speaking, and I could add, I mean, I agree with Mr. Dick. We can't help everyone. So at some point, we have to set parameters. We have to prioritize. And in fact, we're already prioritizing. If you look at Mr. Casasola's testimony yesterday, talking about how does the UNHCR select which priorities they're going to designate in terms of resettlement, they're already putting priorities in place. It's just it may not everybody will necessarily agree on what those priorities are. So it's not an issue of prioritization, it's an issue of how we prioritize. And I mean, the UNHCR is a very large bureaucracy. It's like if you try to make a policy change, it's like trying to turn around the Titanic. It simply cannot be as fast as and everybody would want it to be. And like I said, they're a wonderful organization. I'm not criticizing them. It's just that they're a very large organization. I mean, if you look at the fact that it wasn't until 2007 that the UNHCR actually publicly recognized that Iraqis needed to be resettled. There have been people targeted for eradication in Iraq since 2003. It took 4 years for them to announce publicly that they were in favor of resettling them. So, I mean, those are just two examples of my point. And I don't think, I respect my friend Janet Dench so much, but I don't think this is about politicizing, and it's not about lobbying. We're talking about groups that are subject to genocide. It's not who has the loudest voice. It's who's being targeted for these kinds of horrific, horrific crimes.
Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Ms. Kwan, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. You know, we've reached an interesting juncture, I think, in the meetings that we're having around the issues of how to address, I think, the crises that exist in terms of the great needs that are there. On the issue around genocide, and we heard compelling testimony earlier today around the need for action, and how do we deal with a group of women and girls who are enslaved sexually and faced with horrific circumstances, as an example. We heard also from the Sikhs and Hindu community in Afghanistan and the situation that they're in. The LGBTI community, some 63, I believe, countries declared that it is illegal for someone to have a different sexual orientation. And so how do we deal with these situations? So on the question around prioritizing, and I get it, I actually get all of the arguments here that's been presented, the inequities of prioritizing and picking a particular group, and then of course not doing so also means that there are these huge situations where particular groups are being singled out and being targeted with tremendous, horrific atrocities that they're faced with. So how do we solve this problem? And I think that's the question before us today. So source country has been identified for the people who are inland, and they have no capacity, no stream within which they can make application today. It seems to me, and I wonder if I can get a quick answer from everybody around the table, is that part of the solution in actually bringing back the source country classification? So that's my first question, and a quick answer because we're limited to 7 minutes.
Who would you like to start with?
We'll start with Mr. Walsh here, and then we'll go to Janet, and then to Brian, if that's okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, source country is one possibility. Use of H&C discretion is another possibility, which would not require legislative change.
Thank you. Janet?
Yes, I agree. I think that the source country class, we regretted the fact that it was eliminated. It did need some reform, but we would be very interested in finding some ways to make it viable. And as Chantal has said, there are also other mechanisms that can be used and that can be more flexible, such as the use of TRPs, temporary resident permits.
And Brian?
Yeah, I think I don't know if I have much to add. I think Source had problems, but it could be a way, or there could be a mechanism to work with internally displaced people. I think it would take a lot of work to figure out what that would look like in terms of different environments to work with, selection process, getting people out physically. There are challenges, but certainly thinking about how we can relate with IDPs as a resettlement tool is something to think about.
I would invite then all of the witnesses to provide additional submissions to the clerk on that issue, on what you think the reform needs to be and how do we overcome these challenges that exist. So moving on to a second phase of my questions, and which is the inequities that exist. So given that we have all these crises going on, how do we square this circle then? Can we, for example, keep the generalized priorities that already exist, which the UNHCR do already process, which the government, by the way, when they brought in the Syrian Refugee Initiative, they already have identified priorities as well: women, children, family, and the LGBT community. The problem that's surfacing right now, particularly, for example, in those streams that they have identified to be priorities, are the LGBTI community. They have no way of tracking it. They have no idea how well we're doing, in fact, on that score. So then we need a different mechanism when we know that those individuals are at particular risks. What can we do to help them to make application and get into the stream? Likewise with the Yazidis, women and girls, and so on. So I won't name all of the groups that's presented, but in that situation, is it something that we can come forward with to, in the source countries, in these particular groups, that these are specialized programs that we would target in that instance to try to address the immediate crisis to which that our international community is faced with today. So again, I'll go around the table for quick responses because I think I'm fast running out of time. Chantal?
I think there are two separate issues here. There's prioritization of refugee referrals from HCR, and also whether there's, how do you deal with people who don't meet those criteria. So I think that all it would take in terms of resettlement is to let the UNHCR know that we want to add or take away these specific priorities for any given time. All we have to do is let them know that these are the kinds of people that we want. In terms of your other question, with source country, I mean, the issue with source country is it's everybody from that country who's in a refugee-like situation. That doesn't really help if you're trying to target a specific subgroup. I think Section 25 would be more suitable for something like that.
Janet?
I'd like to highlight the situation of Africa and the fact that about a third or more than a third of the people in need of resettlement are in Africa, but they tend to be marginalized again and again. And of course, the committee has heard very many compelling cases, and I'm sure we would agree on all of those ones that they should be priorities. But I want to also urge for you that there are other groups that you're not hearing who probably have just as compelling stories and cases for them to be priorities as well. The other point is to highlight the gender-related analysis. Canada used to be known for having a leadership role in terms of resettling women at risk. We seem to have fallen off on that side, so I think it would be good for us to try to look again about how are we looking at the ways in which people are persecuted and at risk, particularly on the basis of their gender.
Brian?
And finally, I think that one of the things we should think about is getting out of the silos in terms of immigration and global affairs Canada, and even in terms of different streams of immigration, and look for a multiple tools to deal with situations. And so we look at a particular region or a particular country and the conflict there, and look at many different ways that we can solve it, so that resettlement can be one piece, and particularly private sponsorship can be a piece of that. But making sure that it fits with everything else that's going on. And that takes collaboration across departments, I think.
Thank you. Mr. Tabara, 7 minutes, please.
I'll be splitting some of my time with Mr. Ferrani. We've heard a lot of testament, and thank you for being here. I think everyone will agree the issue of refugees, it's not going to diminish. If there's instability and conflict in war zones and war-torn countries, we're going to have refugees. We're going to have people fleeing destruction. You mentioned eradicating ISIS or Daesh. Everyone will agree with you in this room that that is one objective. But I mean, there would still be more militants going up in the ranks. There would still be another militia group. So security and stabilization of a country is imperative, and I think the international community needs to work very hard on that, because Daesh is not the only end-all of militant groups that are causing destruction. There's many others in the world, including El Salvador, Honduras, etc., etc. But I wanted to talk about a little bit on prioritizing. This is the reason why the United Nations we have a second group or an institution that looks at the most vulnerable, and they have a set structure to look at most vulnerable. We've been talking about in this committee about Christians, about Muslim Sunnis, about Muslim Shias. No one's even mentioned about people that maybe aren't even practicing a faith. They're very vulnerable people as well. And I think that's something that this committee needs to add in. But my question I wanted to ask to Ms. Dyke and, or Mr. Dyke and Ms. Stench is, you mentioned Africa, the need in Africa. I wanted to touch on that. You mentioned that the refugees are left out there and politicized. Can I begin with Ms. Stench, and can you elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you. The caps that Brian Dick was referring to have been particularly affecting refugees from Africa. There's been very serious limits on the numbers of refugees that can be sponsored out of Africa. The timelines for processing have been particularly long. And the other constraints mean that it is very difficult for a private sponsor to put in an application to sponsor an African refugee. We are hearing a lot from our members who are of African origin who point out the very, very vast and compelling needs in the region, and who see that there is a lot of response from Canada to, and rightly so, nobody is questioning that, but to the situation in the Middle East. But when you look at the scale of the problems, and it's highlighted right now in Kenya, where the Kenyan government has said that it is going to close the refugee camps and kind of create a forced return to Somalia, affecting hundreds of thousands of people potentially. And so, of course, there are many people there who are extremely anxious about that situation, and there are many vulnerable people who are in those refugee camps. So that's an urgent situation, which many of us feel is not getting the attention that it deserves. We can also speak of the situation in Eritrea. Very, very serious human rights abuses going on. Canada has some level of responsibility in that we have Canadian companies that are involved in mining in that country and have been alleged to have contributed to abuses in terms of the workers at those mines. So I think that we need to do more to pay attention to the situations in Africa and to respond to the refugees there.
And Janet touched on, I think, a lot of important things. I think one of the things that we're seeing this year is exciting is that because the landing targets for privately sponsored this year is 17,800, we are seeing a lot of arrivals from Africa. No, or very few new cases are going in, but there are a lot of arrivals, and it does feel for many of us like we're turning the corner and we might get a chance to see more new sponsorships. But there are a lot of people desperate there. I mean, if you think about the Eritreans, I'm thinking in particular, they're one of the populations that is fleeing across the Mediterranean in large numbers, and you don't do that unless you're very desperate. So those are a lot of places where there are people in Canada who really want their friends and relatives to be here because they're very worried about them, and they feel very frustrated because there have been limits in terms of what they can do.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to...
Mr. Chair, a clarification and two short questions for Ms. Dench. In the I guess the speech by Ms. Rempel, she referred to a television interview, and that was with yours truly, and she indicated that I failed to respond to why the government had been making a massive effort to settle Syrians as a priority. And what I said at that time on the CBC, and what I'll say again now, is that because the largest international humanitarian crisis since World War II involves Syrian nationals. We've heard about 60 million people in movement in the world. 12 million of them are Syrian. I said that then. I guess Ms. Rempel just couldn't recollect that. It's quite apparent to our government, it's quite apparent to the Canadian public about the magnitude of that crisis. Apparently it's not apparent to her. In terms of Ms. Dench, I want to ask you a question. Thank you for your testimony. You used the quote, dishonorable recent history or dishonorable recent practice of Canada when you said it had attempted to specify or favor particular ethnicities among the UNHCR referrals. Could you clarify, were you speaking about the areas of focus program of the previous government?
No, we were speaking about the Syrian, the selection of Syrians, where we knew that the Canadian government was preparing to make an announcement in December 2014 of its commitments to bring Syrian refugees, and the announcement was delayed because, as we understand it, and seemed to be confirmed after the fact, that Canada was wanting UNHCR to accept that it would discriminate on the basis of religion, which is a very, very fundamental principle. One of the basic principles of refugee protection is it's a measure against discrimination. So it is completely unacceptable, and of course the UNHCR was not willing to accept Canada making such an announcement. So we were ashamed as Canadians that Canada would be taking such a position, and we're glad that in the event that has not come into place.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their insights, their recommendations, and the tremendous work that they do with some of the most vulnerable around the globe. Thank you so much. And with that, our meeting adjourns.